Okay, now it should work. Sweet. I can hear myself even louder. So a quick explanation of what those words mean. I am going to be covering 40 topics in the next 40 minutes. If you are good at division, that will indicate that there is one topic per minute. Daryl here is going to be enforcing the time limit. He will be advancing the slides, and he will be yelling into the mic when I need to go to the next slide. It is his job to make sure that I keep going. I don't get to keep talking. I have to go on to the next thing. So I've prepared a little thing about all 40 topics. They all should be relatively interesting. Some of you may already know these things, some of you may not, but I think I'm ready to go. We're ready to go over there? Let's do this. Start the clock whenever you're ready. Maybe?
I mean, I'm hitting the button. Maybe it's left. Maybe it is left.
No?
Okay.
You are so ready.
Can
I put sadness on the stack?
Is it plugged in?
Turn it off, turn it back on again.
What am I doing?
If we emotionally point it that way.
Okay.
It's over there. No, okay.
You can start.
Go.
Man, this is a fun one to start with because it's kind of complicated. What I wanted to talk about here is there are lots of spells and abilities and effects in the game that ask you to choose a source of damage. A source of damage has a specific definition, and it can be things that it doesn't make sense. So you can always choose any object or permanent on the battlefield, any object on the stack, but there's also this little nitpicky rule that says you can choose any object that is referred to by an object on the stack or anything that has pending damage waiting to happen. For example, there's a card called Mog Fanatic. Mog Fanatic says sacrifice Mog Fanatic, deal 1 damage to target creature or player. Once you sacrifice Mog Fanatic, it's no longer an object on the battlefield, and the spell or the ability on the stack isn't going to be the source of the damage. So if you wanted to, say, harm's way it or prevent damage from a source, you have to choose Mog Fanatic, and you need to have the ability to know that Mog Fanatic is going to do that damage. So this is part of section 1 of the comprehensive rules. I would suggest...
Next.
Okay, receiving priority. So in receiving priority, I wanted to talk about 2 things that happen before a player receives priority. The first one is checking state-based actions, and the second one is putting triggers on the stack. Many of you may know that we do them in that order. First, we're going to check state-based actions, then we're going to put triggers on the stack, then we're going to check state-based actions again. This is relevant for a few different situations. The one I like to bring up is suppose you have a Knight of Souls Betrayal or some other effect that gives all creatures -1/-1, and you cast Eternal Witness. Eternal Witness is going to enter the battlefield, and its trigger is going to wait to go on the stack. Then we're going to check state-based actions. Eternal Witness is going to die and be in the graveyard, and then we will put the trigger on the stack. So Eternal Witness will be able to target itself to bring itself back, which is kind of counterintuitive, but it does work. It also works with a couple other cards that allow you to kill your own creatures. What else did I want to mention? Oh, this lets you generate Infinite Storm if you already have infinite mana, which is kind of... Okay, mana abilities. Mana abilities are specifically a few different things. What I wanted to mention here is that mana abilities are activated abilities which could generate mana that don't have a target and aren't loyalty abilities. So that means things like Deathrite Shaman's ability that targets lands in a graveyard that generates mana are not mana abilities, and Chandra's -2, or whatever the current one is, that gives you red, +1. It is not a mana ability. However, it is possible for a mana ability to not produce mana and still be a mana ability, the canonical example being Reflecting Pool, that has the ability to tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, of a color that a land you control could produce, and it's possible to not have a color that Reflecting Pool could make, but that doesn't mean its ability is not a mana ability. It continues to be a mana ability. Also, mana abilities are any triggered ability that makes mana, doesn't have a target, and triggers off of a mana ability.
Next.
Or, okay, sweet, Plane Chase and Plane Cards. So a couple of these are talking about specific Magic variants. Plane Chase is a Magic variant that is played as a multiplayer game in which each player has a planar deck, or the entire table sometimes has a planar deck. Each planar card is an oversized Magic card that has 2 abilities. The first ability is usually a static ability or a triggered ability. Sometimes it will give you some static effect that changes the way the game is played. For example, on the Naya plane, you get to play 2 additional lands every turn. Some of these planes will have triggered abilities that trigger when you go to them, or when you leave them, or when you do something. The Plane Chase cards also have a second half of the card, which has a triggered ability that triggers when you roll the chaos symbol on the planar die, and the planar die is an extra die we always use in Plane Chase. The players are allowed to roll by paying mana. They get to roll the die once for free every turn during their main phase, and then they have to play 1 additional mana for each additional time they roll it. So it's 1 mana for the second one and 2 mana. Sweet. Loyalty abilities. Loyalty abilities are the abilities that Planeswalkers have. Each loyalty ability is represented by a up arrow with a plus sign and a plus number in it, a down arrow with a minus sign and a minus number in it, or a 0, the 0 number. They are activated abilities. As I mentioned before, they can't be mana abilities, and they do use the stack. There are some restrictions on when you can use loyalty abilities. Each player, so each Planeswalker can only have its loyalty ability activated once per turn, no matter what. There's kind of a weird corner case here where if you're playing Two-Headed Giant, and I play a Planeswalker, and then I activate its ability, and my partner manages to gain control of my Planeswalker, they will not get to activate it again. The restriction is applied to the Planeswalker itself, and it is not applied to the player activating the loyalty ability. It is possible for non-Planeswalker objects to gain loyalty abilities. They are not able to, okay, we're going on. Mana symbols. There are a bunch of different mana symbols in the game. I wanted to kind of enumerate them and mention things that aren't mana symbols. Each of the 5 colored mana symbols are mana symbols. We also have 10 additional mana symbols for each guild, so each 2-color combination gets a mana symbol. We have the 5 Phyrexian mana symbols, and then we have a bunch more hybrid mana symbols for, or 2-brid mana symbols as we call them, where half of it is 2 mana and the other half is a colored mana. There are a few things that look like mana symbols but aren't mana symbols. The one I like to call it to attention is there is one card in New Phyrexia that has a Phyrexian mana symbol phi in its text box that refers to something having Phyrexian mana, but it is not a mana symbol itself. This can matter for another slide we're going to get to later that talks about how we change the costs. Sweet. Leveler cards. So this is a level up or leveler card. It has 3 separate parts of its text box, and they kind of don't exist the way that they look like they do. Each of these boxes represents a static ability that says if this creature has enough level counters on it, then it gains this ability and has this power and toughness. So for example, Lighthouse Chronologist's last ability, this entire box says as long as Lighthouse Chronologist has 7 or more loyalty counters on it, it has that ability, and it's a 3/5. Level counters on it. Level Up is an activated ability, and because of how that static ability works, it is possible to have a leveler card lose all its abilities and therefore not have the correct power and toughness. It's kind of a weird section of the rules. If you're super curious, you should look it up. Hybrid cost reduction. Sweet, we got to this one quickly. We just talked about hybrid mana like 2 slides ago. There are effects in the game that ask you to reduce the cost of something you do by an amount of mana in the mana cost of something. And if you are asked to reduce the amount of mana by a hybrid mana, then you get to choose which half. If you choose a colored half, like a red half of a hybrid mana symbol, then you can reduce the cost by red mana. If you choose the 2 half of a 2-brid mana symbol, you get to reduce it by the 2 mana half. And now I can't remember. I do not believe you can choose the Phyrexian half of a Phyrexian mana, but I can't remember. And what else did I have? I don't think I have anything else useful.
And next.
Huh? Wingdings? Yes. Defending player. I can't remember. This is the difficulty in this, is I don't remember what I'm supposed to say. Yeah, I guess we can discuss Two-Headed Giant. In Two-Headed Giant, both players are the defending player, except when it matters. I think the thing I wanted to talk about here, which is really weird, is that in a normal two-player game, as soon as, oh, that's what it was. So you're only a defending player during the attack step, and in a normal two-player game, as soon as you get to the beginning of combat step, the game automatically says the other player is the defending player, that whoever isn't the active player becomes a defending player, and they continue to be the defending player until the end of combat step. In a multiplayer game, okay, Cascade. Cascade is a triggered ability that appears on different cards. Cascade says when you cast the card, you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land card that has the converted mana cost less than the the cost of the spell you cast, and you may cast it without paying its mana cost. Probably the most important thing to remember about Cascade when you're interacting with it day to day, I guess, is that the actual cascading part is not optional. The casting part is optional. So if you get a counterspell, you don't have to counterspell your own thing, but you can't actually skip the part where you flip things over. So you're always going to get a shuffled library, even if you don't want to shuffle your library.
How does cost work with two hybrids?
Huh?
Cost would work with two hybrids?
How does what?
Cascade cost work.
Oh, with two hybrids. Yeah, so two hybrid mana, that changes the converted mana cost of the card. So it would mean that it always counts as 2 when you're calculating the converted mana cost. Okay, casting a spell. See, this one's completely unfair because I don't have enough time to explain how to cast a spell. But in order, the steps of casting a spell are move it from the zone that it's in onto the stack and show it to your opponent. Choose any modes, kickers, buybacks, anything else that you need to choose during the casting of a spell. Then you need to choose targets for the spell. Then you need to distribute anything that you would need to distribute for the spell. For example, if you cast Arc Lightning, you have to choose which creature gets 2 and which creature gets 1 at this point during casting the spell. The next thing you do is figure out what the spell costs, what its total mana cost is. You apply any cost increases, then any cost reductions, and then anything that is Trinisphere. And then you have the opportunity to activate mana abilities, and then you pay all of the costs in whatever order you want, and then the spell becomes cast, and anything that triggers when you cast a spell triggers. Yes, Brian?
Next.
We're out of time, I'm sorry. So in the pregame procedure, I wanted to just quickly discuss another part of the section 1 of the rules. The first thing that happens in the pregame procedure is you need to use a equally random way to determine who goes first. That player decides who goes first. They become the starting player. They're not the active player yet. Then the starting player gets to do a bunch of things followed by those things from the non-starting player. They include choosing mulligans. So when we mulligan, the starting player chooses whether to mulligan, then the non-starting player chooses whether to mulligan. They mulligan at the same time. They continue to do that until they're happy with their mulligans. Then we do the scry part of the mulligan procedure. And once the scry has completed, we move to the pregame actions part of the pregame procedure, during which the starting player can take any number of pregame actions that they hand with whatever is in their hand, and then the non-active player does this. Okay, parts of a card. So there's a bunch of cards of Labyrinth Champion that I just wanted to point out, and whether they are technically characteristics or not. Characteristics are things that the game cares about and can change. Non-characteristics don't really have any impact on the game. So the name is a characteristic, or the name of a card is part of its text, and the text is a characteristic. Anyways, the name, the mana cost is a characteristic. We have the art. The art has no meaning. The art has no rules meaning. The comprehensive rules is very clear that the art has no rules meaning. What's up?
Chase would be affected by that.
Chase's name also has no rules meaning.
Also affected.
Okay. Is Wizards of the Coast defended by the copyright having no rules meaning?
Probably.
Okay, so we have the type line. We have a type, the creature, and the subtypes human warrior. We have the set symbol and its text box. Its text box has 2 parts. It has its rules text and its flavor text, which also has no rules meaning. And we have the power and toughness. Delayed zone change triggers. So this slide I wanted to talk about a specific part of the mistriggers rules that say when you have a delayed zone change trigger that is set up at one point and is supposed to apply later, you can never miss that trigger. The canonical example of this is Prized Amalgam, and Prized Amalgam says if this is in your graveyard and a creature you control dies, then you get to return it from your graveyard to play. You shaking your head?
I don't
Okay.
like it.
I know you don't like it. Look, that doesn't change what the rules do. So this means that if you forget to return your prized amalgam, or you forget to return your thing from Oblivion Ring, or you forget to return your Obsidat, whatever it's called, then whenever you notice, we will return the thing then. Your opponent will still get to choose whether the thing returns right then or at the beginning of the next phase, so you can't just suddenly remember your sweet trigger in the middle of when you need it. Okay, checklist cards. The checklist cards represent double-faced cards when you want to play double-faced cards in your deck but don't want to actually use them. So for example, if you have, the things I wanted to mention here are that you have to choose whether to use checklist cards for each double-faced card in your deck. So if you have Search for Azcantas and Jace Vryn's Prodigy in your deck, you can either use all the regular cards, all checklist cards, or Jaces as checklists or Searches as checklists, but you can't have 2 Jaces as checklists and 2 not Jaces as checklists. This is because the game says that when you choose to use a checklist card for a specific card, all other copies of that card don't exist. They are not cards, they are not part of your deck, they are extra stuff that you have with you. This is specifically relevant. We've had situations where we've given decklist problem numbers. So the game, Magic the game only cares about integer numbers and generally only cares about non-negative numbers. This matters because sometimes you're asked to do math, and math can be fun, but in the end, the game says that if you are going to generate a fractional number, the effect that generates it will tell you whether to round up or round down. And if you, Unless it's an uncard, but I mean, we don't all live in silver bordered land, Frank. If you generate a negative number for an effect that asks for that number, then it's going to generate 0 instead. This is a recent rules change and applies to cards that say give all your creatures +X, where X is the power of a creature. A creature is allowed to have negative power. You'll use that negative power to do the math, but in the end, because we're asking for this number, we're going to get 0, and a negative power creature isn't going to make everything less. Okay, draft rules. Yes, draft does rule. So I wanted to cover a few things here. I know some people haven't drafted as much. The first thing is about zone drafting. Zone drafting is a construct of drafting in which we all agree that we have 3 zones in front of us. One zone is the cards that we currently have in our hand and are picking from. One zone is the cards we have passed to the person on our left or on our right. And one zone is the cards that are incoming to us from the other side. We will all agree to zone draft, and that means we will not have more than 1 pack in any one of those zones at a time. Or as a result, we are not going to stack packs up on the next person. This is really bad when it goes bad. I had a draft at GP Albuquerque where I had to remove a card from the draft. I don't have quite enough time to explain what happened there, but essentially they managed to mix packs up enough, and then they came out of a tunnel of packs being connected, and they just had an extra card. Okay, this is anti, and this shouldn't be in here. Just go to the next slide. Okay. Identifying replacement effects. So most of you will know that there is one word we use to identify whether something is a replacement effect. Does anyone know what that is? Instead tells us that things are replacement effects. There are 3 other things that identify replacement effects, specific things. 2 of them use the word as, and they are when as something enters the battlefield or as something does another thing, do something. So for example, Pithing Needle says as Pithing Needle enters the battlefield, choose the name of a card, and that is a replacement effect that changes how it enters the battlefield. We also have as things are turned face up, which is similar to entering the battlefield, but it changes when we have morphs that get turned face up. And the final one is things entering the battlefield with counters. So that is also a replacement effect. So your Walking Ballista entering the battlefield with X counters on it is a replacement effect. Slow play. Slow play is really fun, but not really. I am not awesome at slow play, but I have a few pieces of advice that I try to follow myself. First is when you're following a match, if you kind of calculate what someone is supposed to do and you manage to figure it all out and they haven't figured it out yet, that probably means they're trying to dig too deep and you should move towards slow play. When you do want to issue a slow play warning, we always want to give the players a little bit of notice before we do that. And it's perfectly fine to, once a player makes a move, or if they've taken way too long, just be like, hey, I need you to make a move, I need you to play faster, make them aware that they're playing slowly, and usually they'll speed up. And if they don't, you can go ahead and issue the slow play warning. It's worth noting that a slow play warning does upgrade after a second slow play warning to a game loss. So you don't need to be careful, but it is different than most game rule violations.
Next.
And copying a spell. So when we copy a spell, we get everything about the spell, and we make a new copy of it. It's kind of like copying a creature. But when we talked about casting a spell, we talked about choosing modes and targets and dividing things and all these special things when we cast a spell. When you copy a spell, you get all of those things, and you don't get to choose them again. The exception being that many things that copy a spell say you can choose new targets for the copy, so you'll get to specifically choose new targets. I don't believe there's anything that lets you choose new modes or anything else.
Do you distribute new things newly since we have new targets?
If you are choosing new targets for a spell that has things distributed, you effectively get to do that because you can say the target that was chosen to have 2 of something changes to that, and the target that was chosen to have 1 of something changes to that. Although, that makes me wonder if you could, change the targets to move the 2 to where the
Next.
1 was and the 1. Anyways, layers of continuous effects. This one's also super unfair, so I'm not going to attempt to explain what all the layers are, but they are in order in case you wondered. Copy, control, text type, color, ability, power, and toughness. And inside power and toughness, we have characteristic defining abilities, things that set power and toughness, things that modify power and toughness, counters, and then power and toughness switching. The thing I did want to mention with layers of continuous effects is that they are really important because of finding a way to make the game consistent. If we didn't have the layers and we had tried to apply everything in timestamp order, it would be very easy to get confused. The very simple example I like to use here is if you have an effect that sets something to be a 1/1 and you have an effect that gives it +3/+3, layers lets us know that it's always going to be a 4/4. And if you didn't have that and you applied it in timestamp order, you would have to remember. And if you had effects that applied over multiple turns, you might have trouble remembering. It might be difficult. And as soon as you make these things more
Next.
complicated, it becomes difficult. Okay, Archenemy. Archenemy is another multiplayer variant. This one's usually played between one person who's the archenemy and a bunch of other people who are playing against them. The archenemy gets an additional oversized deck, kind of like Plane Chase, but the plebes don't get that deck. The archenemy's deck has scheme cards, and the scheme cards are either schemes that get set in motion and have a triggered ability when they're flipped up. The archenemy is going to flip up 1 scheme per turn at the beginning of their main phase, and it's going to do something. The regular schemes, my favorite being Perhaps You've Met My Cohort. It says when you set the scheme in motion, search your library for a Planeswalker and put it into play. It's completely fair. And then there's ongoing schemes, and ongoing schemes kind of work like enchantments that just change the rules of the game, obviously in the archenemy's favor. A ongoing scheme will hang around on the battlefield, or not on the battlefield, in the command zone. Okay, gaining and losing types. So what I wanted to talk about here is that each type, or many types, have associated subtypes that go with them. For example, the type creature has creature types associated with it. Lands have land types, artifacts have artifact types, planeswalkers have planeswalker types. When you gain or when you lose a type, you lose all of the associated types that go with it. It's impossible to be, so for example, if we turn Gideon into a creature and he stops being a planeswalker, he no longer is a Gideon, because Gideon is not a creature type, and he cannot be a Gideon while he is not a creature. The other thing worth noting here is when you are granted or you are specifically told to become a basic land type, for example, Blood Moon, this
Next.
overrides the text of the card. Split Second. So Split Second is a static ability that exists on instants and sorcery, or it exists on all spells, or on many spells. And it says that other players are not allowed to activate abilities and cast spells while the spell is on the stack. There's kind of only one thing that you can do while a split-second spell is on the stack, and that's take a special action, and the only relevant special action is usually turning a morph card face up. I think it might be possible to do other things. What's up, Frank?
You can concede.
Oh, yeah, of course, you can concede.
Can you mana ability?
Yes, triggers do go on the stack. You cannot activate, you must be able to activate mana abilities. What's up?
Like Rose hitting back punishing fire something.
Yeah, but that's correct. So you can activate mana abilities, but you can't activate regular abilities or cast spells. Did I want to mention that?
Next.
Okay, good. So looking at extra cards is an infraction in the IPG, and there were a couple things I wanted to mention here. The first one being that it's possible to get a infraction or get a penalty for looking at extra cards without actually seeing the faces of any cards. There's this neat little exception that says if you've managed to move cards, or it doesn't actually say this anymore, but essentially if you move cards far enough away that you could have seen them, for example, you're shuffling your library and you drop some cards on the floor, no matter how hard you try to not look at them, we're still going to give looking at extra cards because there's a chance you see them, we're still going to put them back in. The other thing worth noting is that, I know this is said over and over again, but if you give looking at extra cards, we're going to take the cards and put them back into the unknown portion of wherever they came, usually the library, and you're going to shuffle it into the previously unknown portion, leaving behind any cards where we knew they were. So if we have a Sensei's Divining Top, or we've scryed cards to the bottom, or scryed cards to the top,
Next.
or Cascaded, we leave them there. Declaring attackers. So declaring attackers has several steps. It's kind of a long list. It's kind of like casting a spell within the beginning of one step. The first thing that's going to happen when you get to the declare attacker step is the active player is going to attempt to choose a set of creatures for which it is legal to attack with. What we care about here is that we have what are called restrictions on attacking and requirements for attacking. Requirements are like, this creature has to attack every turn, and restrictions are like, this creature can't attack unless you're attacking with 3 creatures. You can never break any restrictions, and you have to meet as many requirements as possible. So the game kind of does a calculation and says, what's the most requirements that we can make? And if you've managed to choose a set of creatures that matches or has at least that many requirements, then you get to attack. From that point, the player chooses whether they want to pay the cost for attacking
Next.
for each creature. Playing a land. So playing a land is a special action that happens, that a player can use when that is their turn during their main phase when the stack is empty, and they can use it to play a land from their hand into play. There are restrictions on playing a land, like the 1 per turn, and we have some rules in the comprehensive rules that say when we're calculating whether a player can play a land, we look at the total number of lands that they are allowed to play this turn and subtract from that the number of lands they have played from this turn, and if the remaining number is positive, they get to play a land. This can be relevant when you bounce explorations. There used to be a previous rule that tied land drops to things that gave you extra land drops. That doesn't exist anymore. And the other thing worth noting is that you can never play a land when it is not your turn. If an effect tells you to play a land in the middle of combat, you can play a land in the middle of combat, but only if it's your turn. If it's not your turn, not allowed to play a land.
Putting a land into play is not.
Putting a land into play is not playing a land.
Next.
Zone change triggers. So zone change triggers are triggers that trigger when something changes zones, logically. Usually, zone change triggers trigger from whatever zone the thing is going into. So if you have a trigger that says, whenever this creature goes from your graveyard to exile, do something, it triggers from exile as the creature looks like in exile. There is a, an exception to this. It's that triggers that trigger from a creature going from the graveyard or to the graveyard from the battlefield specifically trigger from the battlefield how the creature looked like on the battlefield. So for example, if you have a creature with a dies trigger, when this creature dies, deals 2 damage to everything, and another permanent that says cards in graveyards lose all abilities, when that dies, it will still trigger based on what it looked like on the battlefield. Note that this doesn't apply when the trigger says, the Planeswalker redirection rule. So the Planeswalker redirection rule currently says whenever non-combat damage would be dealt to a player from a source that player doesn't control, the controller of the source can choose whether to have that damage redirected to a Planeswalker that player controls. A few things are worth noting here. First, that it is required to be non-combat damage. I know this is fairly intuitive, but sometimes it does come up on judge tests. It's impossible to attack with a bunch of creatures, connect, and then be like, whoa, 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 Jace. Jace, we need to kill the Jace. I know we're used to that, but non-combat is a word that's there. And the other thing is that it has to be damage that an opponent source controls. So if you cast Earthquake, which does X damage to each creature and each player, you can't be like, whoa, 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 Jace, I don't want to die. Give it to my Jace. It doesn't work like that. The caveat here is, okay, great. So this is where I get to plug MTG IPGcom. This is a forwarding site that I have set up for these many great domains. If you need to get, I sit at a computer all day long at work. I'm not usually on my phone, so if I want to look up the comprehensive rules, I'm not going to pull up my tiny screen. I'm going to type in cr.mtg.ipg.com. mtr.mtgipg.com gets you to the Magic Tournament rules. The third one, PDF, gets you to a PDF copy of the IPG. Detrimental gets you to the list of all the detrimental triggered abilities in Standard, which can often be useful. Toby.mtgipg.com gets you to Toby's latest blog post that explains new changes to the rules. JAR will get you to the Judging at Regular Rules Enforcement level. PEIP stands for the Premier Events Invitation Policy, and it will get you to that in case you need to know how many pro points you need to get silver. And then finally, MAP gets you to a map of the World Judge regions, and Timer gets you to a nice little useful timer. Extra turns and phases. So what I wanted to talk about here is that when you are granted an extra turn or an extra phase is put into the game, it is always put into the game right after wherever it was asked to be put, which is relevant when there are multiple extra turns happening at the same time. So if I get an extra turn and then my opponent gets an extra turn, their extra turn is going to happen before mine. There's kind of like a reverse, there's like a queue of, or not a queue, a stack of extra turns waiting to happen at the end of your turn. So if you ever get into an extra turns difficult situation, I would highly advise pulling out some extra cards and like using them to represent the extra turns, because like one extra turn pretty easy to handle, two extra turns pretty easy to handle. It's suddenly when you have Time Sifter and a bunch of other things making difficult extra turns that it becomes complicated. Extra phases are possible to happen.
Next.
Okay. Emblems are objects that only exist in the command zone. They can't be destroyed. They generally can't be targeted, not that there's anything that would ever want to be targeted. They don't have a color. They don't have a mana cost. They don't have any of those other sweet characteristics. They generally just have one ability that lets you do something. You can't ever get rid of emblems. They're kind of like poison counters. The only way you can ever get rid of an emblem is if you have a Karn that's going to help you restart the game.
They don't have names.
Yeah, they don't have names. Emblems do not persist in subgames. Yes, an emblem can be a source if it is about to do damage or it created something. I had something else, but I can't remember now. They're not cards. They're just these things that happen. Huh? No, they're not tokens. Token doesn't have, well, I guess token has rules meaning.
Next.
Okay. Unearth is an activated ability that shows up on creature cards. Unearth is kind of like Flashback, but for creatures. It says you pay its cost, you return the creature card with Unearth to the battlefield, and it gains haste, and then you exile it at the next end step. Unearth, like Flashback, has a replacement effect it sets up that says if the creature would leave the battlefield to go anywhere but exile, it goes to exile instead. So if you unearth a creature and then Doomblade it, it's going to exile. The important thing to remember here is that it only cares if it's going to somewhere other than exile. So if I unearth a creature and you flash in Castaway, and that exiles the unearthed creature, it went to exile, Castaway told it to go to exile, Unearthed saw it goes to exile, Unearthed is super happy, and now Castaway is going to bring it back when it goes away. It's not a go away forever thing, it's only go away forever if it wasn't going to go to exile.
Next.
Redundant abilities. This is my favorite slide. Redundant abilities are just abilities that when you have multiple of them on a card, they don't have any meaning past the first one. So what I wanted to do was see how many redundant abilities we can come up with. Go ahead, Frank. Defender. Anyone else? Lifelink. Yes. Yes. Anyone else? Haste is good. Anyone else? First strike. Trample. Reach. Double strike. Shadow, yes. Gulk is good too. Hexproof. Horsemanship. Shroud. Death Touch. Those are good. Fear, yeah. Also Intimidate. Yes, banding is also redundant. Lifelink is also redundant. Indestructible is also redundant. There aren't very many non-redundant abilities. If they're Menace.
This creature must attack this turn if they
Yeah, it's not really a keyword ability.
Next.
That's true. Choosing a name. So if a card asks you to choose the name of a card, there are a few restrictions that are applied to you. The most common one that's not known is that you have to choose the name of a card that is legal for the format you are playing in. So if you are playing Ixalan Sealed and you get a Sorcerer's Spyglass and you play it, you can't choose Wrath of God or Abandon Hope or Black Lotus or any sweet card. You have to choose a card that's legal for the format.
Oh,
Yes.
if it's like an invention or something, can you name it?
If it's legal in the yes, an invention would be because an invention is legal for the format based on those rules. Yeah. So you could name Wrath of God in Hour of Devastation, Amonkhet Sealed. It is legal to choose the back side of a double-faced card that is the name of a card. And the corner case that comes up here all the time is that tokens have names, but you can't choose Goblin as a name. Deck problem, game losses. So we're going to talk. I wanted to talk about the short little window you have to get a deck problem game loss. A deck problem happens when someone's playing and their deck doesn't match their deck list. But if they discover this before the game starts, while they're still shuffling, this isn't a game loss because they haven't presented. And if we discover it in the middle of the game, we kind of just assume that it happened as part of the game, and we don't give a game loss. And if a player draws a card and realizes it's a sideboard card, then we just put it back in their sideboard and it's not a game loss. The only time that a deck problem game loss happens is in one of two cases. The first one is it's discovered during the presentation period. So I present my deck to the opponent, they count 59, now it's a game loss because my opponent discovered it. And the other case is that the opponent discovers it during the game. So if I use my Jace the Mind Sculptor to Fate Seal you and look at the top card of your library, and I'm like, I don't think that's in your deck, then that's a game loss. Flipping a coin. So there are a few rules that talk about flipping a coin. The first one is that you don't actually have to flip a coin in order to flip a coin. Any mutually agreed random method that generates two possible equally random results can be used to flip a coin. There are two types of coin flip effects in Magic. There are some that say if it comes up heads or it comes up tails. In this case, if we're going to roll a d20, we need to agree on what heads means and what tails means. The other side are if a player wins the flip. If you are instructed to tell whether a player wins the flip, then the player needs to choose either heads or tails before they flip the coin in order to determine whether they won or lost the flip. Thought I had something else. Frank, do you have anything? Because I know you know about this.
Yeah, you can't actually flip a coin.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, technically speaking. Okay, good. One of my favorite slides. So what happens if I have a creature with double strike, trample, and death touch, and you have a creature with at least 2 toughness, and it's indestructible, and I attack and you block? You have to do 2 damage to it.
1 for each strike.
Yeah, 1 for each strike, exactly. So this is because death touch damage isn't death touch damage. It's only death touch damage until the next time state-based actions are checked. So we attack with our sweet double strike, trample, death touch guy. We're allowed to assign only 1 damage to the indestructible blocker because 1 death touch damage is lethal damage. We assign that damage, we trample the rest over. Now we go to regular strike, and in regular strike, that death touch damage has stopped being death touch damage, so we need to assign an additional 1 point of lethal death touch damage to this indestructible creature in order, and then we can trample over the rest. It is. Just 4.
Next.
Okay, shuffling a library. So the rules say a few things about shuffling a library. They specifically say that pile shuffling isn't shuffling. You need to actually randomize it. They also say that if you see the face of a card in your library, then you've effectively seen the whole thing. So you got to shuffle it all again. The 2 interesting ones that I wanted to bring up is that, well, I guess they're kind of the same. If you have either 0 cards or 1 card in your library, you can't really shuffle it. It doesn't really work. You can't shuffle one card. I mean, Frank might be able to show you how to shuffle one card. But even though you can't shuffle one card or 0 cards, the game still considers an action that tells you to shuffle your library as shuffling your library. And there's a few cards that trigger when a player shuffles a library, so those will still trigger and the game will still see those things.
Rules against Battle Blitz?
Huh?
Battle Blitz?
What about it?
Shuffle 2 page.
Yeah, it's slow play.
Next.
Grand Melee. Ah, this one's fun. So Grand Melee is a multiplayer variant of Magic in which you can play with as many players as you want. And they're all going to sit in one big circle, and they're all going to take one turn that's going to pass around the table. But in order to make this go faster, we're going to have multiple turns running at the same time. The way we achieve this is we have what's called a turn marker. The turn marker starts at the starting player, and then we're going to put another turn marker down every 4 players all the way around the table. And every time someone passes turn, they pass the turn marker to the person on their left, and the turn markers move around with a couple rules. Namely, most importantly, you can't move the turn marker onto someone who has the turn marker next to them. So you always have to have one seat in between turn markers. You can't have 2 people taking turns that are right next to each other. And to determine the number of turn markers you should always have one turn marker for each full 4 players you have in the game. So 12 players in the game, you would have 3 turn markers.
You done?
Hmm?
You're done.
That's it? There should be one more slide. Keep going. Yeah, hey, we did it. Hooray. Yeah, the end step. So we still have like 20 minutes. If anyone has any questions about anything that I had to stop in the middle of, I'll go back and cover that. What's up, Alex? Yeah. So you can't name the name of a token unless it's the name of a card. You have to name a card. So there's one card, what's it called? The one that Crib Swap makes. Change? No, it's a different one. There's one card that has the same name as something that a token has. No, I don't think so. There are Llanowar tokens, but those are a little bit different.
What was the card that makes it?
I think it's Crib Swap. But is there a card named Changeling?
There is a card that has, I don't know.
Yeah, I can't remember what it is. There is one card that makes one token that has the same name as a card that you could choose. Huh?
Assembly worker.
Pack okay, that isn't the same card, right? We're talking about like card A makes a token that has a name, and there just so happens to be another card with the same name. Yeah. We talked about Llanowar Elf as well, because it's kind of the same thing. Yeah. Yes. You could name, I think it's Gold Medal Stalwart or something like that. Yeah, you could name Gold Medal Stalwart and get protection from the token. Anyone else questions? I know Spellman had a question. What's that say? Ah, right. I forgot to mention checking to see whether it's legal. You want to remind us where that happens?
Because there was a new type of mechanic that came into play in Arrow. That was high creatures with damage when plays.
So this checks when we're done doing all the other things? Before we pay the cost. Okay. So let's insert check to see whether things are legal.
And if it becomes illegal at that point, you just take it back.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
After all the decisions are made, after they divide the stuff.
okay.
So before any cost determination at all. Yes.
Zach?
Drafting times Sparrow, you can open Urza's Factory and Assembly Worker.
They would be, sure, yes.
So that's
I thought you were asking me about things being legal for the format, but yes. There you go. Crib Swap makes Shapeshifter, and Shapeshifter is a card. That's the, yes.
Free zone drafting.
Uh-huh.
What about revealed cards and conspiracy?
What do you mean?
Considered to be in the same set as the one cards you drafted?
So the revealed cards are usually part of the, so the zone that's in front of you, your main zone, that's cards you're picking from. Cards you've already selected are a separate pile. So the 3 zones are simply talking about cards that are still being drafted.
It's not a zone, but
Yeah, it's,
to be separate.
zone is kind of a bad word to use for it because we usually use it. Yeah, what's up?
So you've got a question from the chat.
Sure.
If I have a Cavern of Souls under a Blood Moon, or if I
Go ahead.
if I had a Cavern of Souls under a Blood Moon enter play, and afterwards I bounced the moon and tried to cast Nameless Race, would that work?
Wait. Are you saying, so you're saying that the Nameless Race doesn't have a creature type, and they're asking if we activate the second ability on Cavern of Souls, which says make a colored mana of any color that can only be used to cast creatures of the type chosen. And you have no type chosen. Yeah, so like no type is not the same as no type. In the same way that no name is not the same as no name.
So once the blood moon leaves, you have to choose a type.
No,
It just says
because it's a replacement effect that, yeah,
that's what I thought. So
Yes.
it has no type, but that's not the same as no type.
correct.
Sweet.
Just like Nameless Race can't ever give something else, like Nameless Race plus a morph and Coat of Arms, no +1/+1. Coat of Arms says each creature gets +1/+1 for each other creature that shares a type with it. No.
What happens in your Cavern of Souls has no type chosen? Can you not activate that ability at all?
You pretty sure you can activate the ability. It will just make a colored mana that can't be used to cast anything.
You can float the mana, but you won't be able to use it on anything because there's no card in Magic that matches the restriction.
Yeah.
Even donkey face down cards?
Huh? Even what?
Casting a card face down from donkey? It's my mana, so.
Or mana of any type.
No, it says mana of any color.
Donkey says type, because it
Oh, it says type. Okay, but still, that type mana types are just like a superset of colors. They aren't. Huh? Yes. 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 Wingding mana is a mana thing. I know. What you mean. Okay, so if nobody else has any questions, I'm done. Yeah, Tim.
Nevermore and Insectile Liberation, can you still cast Delver Secrets?
I can't remember the text of Nevermore.
Name Insectile Liberation, can you cast Delver Secrets? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yes.
From where there, you can only cast air, and you can't fuse it.
Sweet. I'm done. Y'all are free. That was fun.